Progress is a bit of a weird thing, as it's never a straight line from A to B. Your calculations may be incorrect, technology may not work the way you planned, you may have to take one or more steps backwards in order to take several steps forwards, and failure is always an option, to quote Mythbusters. And there is a certain beauty to working hard towards a goal, a dream, a vision. But then you have to ask the question, just because you can do something, does it mean you should? Hi, I'm Rob, and welcome to Gossip News. And today, we're kicking things off with, well, one of my watchwords for 2022, which is unions. Game Workers Unite is set to become the first Australian games industry union. Now, the original organisation is called Game Workers Australia. They're a volunteer-run group who are part of Professionals Australia, which is an advocacy group that represents over 18,000 members across the country. But from this weekend, Game Workers Australia is rebranding to Game Workers Unite, and they will become the first games industry union group. They currently have around 360 members, which represents just over a fifth of the games industry professionals working in Australia. The group will then push for better working conditions, which includes the industry's first enterprise agreement, a collective deal that lays out worker entitlements across a particular company. It also seeks to improve wages for freelancers. Now, this is one of the reasons why I'm an advocate of unions within video games, because right now, there is no representation for contractors, freelancers, low-level employees within developers or publishers. There's nothing. And because of that, executives and directors have been able to literally run roughshod and exploit low-level workers for years. And now, with this push for unionization in games development all over the world, the executives and the directors are running scared. Now, bizarrely enough, there are a couple of examples of this in the news. Both of them, unfortunately, relate to Activision Blizzard. The first one deals with a new complaint to the National Labour Relations Board, the NLRB, from the Communication Workers of America, who have filed an unfair labour charge against the company, alleging that it told workers they could not discuss issues related to the sexual harassment and discrimination lawsuit filed by the state of California against the company. Now, according to the complaint, an employee was threatened by a manager after posting an article about the lawsuit in Slack and discussing holding Activision Blizzard accountable with other co-workers. According to Jessica Gonzalez, who used to work for Blizzard as a senior test analyst and is also cited in the Communication Workers of America's press release, the company has a pattern of retaliation against workers who speak out, which has only gotten stronger as the company faces further legal challenges and complaints. This is the second complaint about Activision Blizzard that's been sent to the National Labour Relations Board, but it doesn't end there, because the state of New York has proposed that Activision Blizzard prepare a report on how it's handling abuse, harassment and discrimination within its ranks, but the publisher has urged its shareholders to vote against it. Now, this is something that was noticed by Axios ahead of Activision Blizzard's annual general meeting in June. The proposal was submitted by New York State's Common Retirement Fund and calls for Activision Blizzard to prepare an annual public report describing and quantifying the effectiveness and outcomes of company efforts to prevent abuse, harassment and discrimination against protected classes of employees. The report would be expected to disclose total number of disputes settled by the company and the amount of money spent to do so, progress towards reducing the average amount of time taken to resolve such complaints, either internally or through litigation, total number of pending complaints regarding sexual abuse, harassment or discrimination, and the amount of hours and pay issued as required by the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing. Now, here's the weird part where history seems to be repeating itself. See, Activision Blizzard's board of directors are unanimously recommending to their shareholders that they vote against this proposal. They basically said, while the board appreciates hearing the perspectives of our shareholders, We do not believe this proposal is in the best interests of the company or its shareholders. Their reasoning seems to be that focusing all their attention on these concerns is the best way to quickly and effectively create genuine change in the workplace, and producing the report itself, even if completed after significant time and expense, would create a set of metrics that are simply not the best measure of how the company is responding to employee concerns. They add that the board is committed to measuring the speed and effectiveness of their changes accurately, not based on metrics that are not precisely tailored to their company's situation. And I say that's bullshit, because the board is obviously trying to continuously sweep things under the carpet or hide them in closets until people forget about them. Whereas producing a report like this is something that would basically have things transparent, have them in plain sight, where the board and the executives can't hide them. And this is where the weird history repeating itself bit is, because Microsoft also faced exactly the same thing. And since things seem to be moving towards them actually buying Activision Blizzard, I think the shareholders have voted at Activision Blizzard and voted yes to selling to Microsoft. I think it was 98% of them voted yes. I would hope that the shareholders at Activision Blizzard follow the shareholders at Microsoft and say, yes, we want to produce this report. We want to make things transparent. I would really hope that the shareholders say, we're not going to listen to the board of directors because we think you're full of shit. You've lied to us far too many times. We're going to produce this report and you're going to follow it. You're going to do what we say for a change. So let's see if history does repeat itself. Anyway, moving on to Sony, who have introduced timed game trials as a requirement for some PlayStation developers. Now, according to the reports, any game that has a wholesale cost of $34 or higher, 33 euros in Europe, or 4,000 yen in Japan, is now required to create time-limited game trials of their games. Now, this means that the trial versions of these games must be at least 2 hours long, and that games that cost lower than $34 wholesale are not required to create limited time trials, according to this new policy. Many developers were informed about this new policy via an update to Sony's developer portal. The good news is that these requirements are not retroactive and do not apply to upcoming PlayStation VR titles. The not so good news is that if you're a developer planning to release on the PlayStation Store in the future, you now need to budget time and resources to create these new time-limited trials. There's some flexibility as part of Sony's policy. Developers have up until 3 months after their game's launch on the PlayStation Store to release these trials, and they're only required to be available to PlayStation Plus Premium members for at least 12 months. Sony are apparently also open to releasing custom game demos instead of time-limited trials, but these will only be approved on a case-by-case basis. Developers are also still free to publish free weekend game trials or custom game demos that can be accessed by all PlayStation owners. And this is bizarre because it seems like we're making a return to the old days when we used to buy computer magazines in the newsagents and they used to have a cassette with a game demo or several game demos or a CD with game demos on. Yeah, I know I'm showing my age by referring to cassettes first, but that was the thing. As kids, we used to buy these magazines all of the time so we could try the latest games on the Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum. And then later on, we used to get them with the floppy disks on the Commodore Amiga and the Atari ST and whatever other home computers we used to have. That's how we had things, because we didn't have the internet. We didn't have this ready stream of content related to video games that we had access to. We just had these magazines. That was it. And you know what the weird thing is? I'm kind of liking this idea that Sony have come up with, because it's something from my childhood, but it's also something that I'm familiar with. The whole idea of game demos and limited trials and stuff like that, and making AAA games follow that route so you can try before you buy. Because games are so expensive now, and they're a luxury in this time when oil prices and gas prices and electricity prices are through the roof. Food prices are creeping up exponentially. Who knows what things are going to cost in the future? And so £70 for a game, it's just money that you cannot afford. It's a luxury. Video games have become something for the people who have more money than sense, or just more money. And so these limited game trials, these demos, are something that becomes a lifeline to gamers. I remember when the demo for Final Fantasy X came out, and one of my housemates was an avid Final Fantasy fan, and he was determined to get the characters up to level 99 within just the demo, just because he wanted to see the limit breaks and stuff like that. That was it. That was his only rationale, and he played the demo over and over again for days and weeks on end. It was all he played. And I can honestly see this becoming a core asset for Sony, because I can see many people actually doing this, playing the timed trials over and over again, playing the game demos over and over again. And if I had to hazard a guess, I think this will influence how the games are made, because if a developer is having to submit a limited time trial, then what they'll probably do is structure the beginning parts of the game in a way that it becomes more like a game demo, and you have a natural cutoff point at which the timed trial would end. Not only that, I think developers will actually look at the aspect of a game demo and treat it as maybe an extra level that you can add on to the game, or maybe a prequel to the game. That's something that I've been seeing a lot of on Steam, which I think is a fantastic idea. Having a prequel to a game is something that could really lend itself to the game, but would also make the player more excited for the game itself, especially if the game is lore heavy. Anyway, we'll wait and see how things turn out, but I would hope that that's something that developers would do. Moving on to Square Enix, and before you all say anything, no, it's not that story, we are getting to that, but before that, Yuji Naka, who cut his teeth in video games development with games like Choo Choo Rocket and the original Sonic games on the Mega Drive and the Sonic games on the Dreamcast, which, Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 were great games. He's also the brains behind Nights of the Dreams and various other games of that ilk. It turns out that he actually took Square Enix to court over the unfinished Balan Wonderworl. Now, according to the translations from the Twitter thread that he posted, he claimed that a business order had removed him as the game's director around half a year before the launch, and that he filed the lawsuit against Square Enix over the matter. Now that the trial is over and the business order is no longer in effect, he has the ability to share more details. Apparently his removal is based on two disputes. The first one concerning the use of a YouTuber to play the game's music in the marketing, rather than using the original score, and the second one is about the co-developer, Arzest, who submitted the game for release without fixing various issues. According to the tweets by Yuji Naka, games should be made by striving to make it a good game until the end, and wanting game fans to enjoy it when they buy it. He also notes that the tight schedule was set by Square Enix's producer rather than himself, and he observed that game creators are often improving games right up until the last minute, citing examples from his days on the original Sonic the Hedgehog game, when the game was changed to make Sonic survive any hit as long as the player had one ring in possession. Now, aside from apologising for releasing an unfinished game, there is one thing from these tweets that I found really interesting, and that's when Yuji Naka says, "I think Square Enix and Arzest are companies that don't care about games and game fans." And that's basically the best segue I can come up with for the main story, which is that Square Enix has sold Eidos Montreal, Crystal Dynamics and Square Enix Montreal to Embracer Group for $300 million, and that deal is going to include 50 back catalogue games, including Tomb Raider, Deus Ex, Thief and Legacy of Kain. It will also potentially include the Marvel games, The Avengers and Guardians of the Galaxy, but that is subject to approval by the license holders. The total acquisition includes 1,100 employees across 3 studios in 8 locations around the world. Now, at a time when Sony are willing to pay $3.6 billion for Bungie and Microsoft are willing to pay $70 billion for Activision Blizzard, $300 million for all of that could be regarded as a steal. But there are some things that you may want to think about. Square Enix will still keep Life is Strange, Outriders, Just Cause and the Square Enix Collective. So they're not completely abandoning the Western market as some commentators have stated. And I don't think it's a case that Square Enix are wanting to abandon the Western market. But I think what's happening is what I mentioned right at the beginning of this episode. They're taking a few steps back in order to make greater progress forward. What that progress is the questionable part, but we'll get to that in a bit. In a statement from Square Enix, the company insists that they're not distancing themselves entirely from Western game development. Going forward, the company's development function will comprise its studios in Japan, Square Enix external studios, and the Square Enix Collective. The company's overseas studios will continue to publish franchises such as Just Cause, Outriders, and Life is Strange. And to be honest, I think this is something that has been on the cards for a while for Square Enix, in that they don't want to be burdened with the legacy of things like the legacy of Kain and Tomb Raider and Deus Ex and Thief and all of those others. All of those games have some kind of baggage, some kind of weight attached to them, which is not linked to Square Enix. Whereas if you look at games like Life is Strange and Just Cause and things like that, those games from the beginning were published by Square Enix. And I think that's where they're refocusing their efforts. Things that are new IPs that they develop or publish themselves from the beginning. And they can have full control over those things. So they can develop them or angle the development of them in certain ways. And this is where it gets a bit dicey. See, I think Square Enix are becoming victims of their own success. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it has to do with the whole idea of NFTs and metaverses and AI and blockchain and all of that stuff. See, that is what Square Enix want to use the money for. According to the official statement, the transaction will assist the company in adapting to the changes underway in the global business environment by establishing a more efficient allocation of resources, which will enhance corporate value by accelerating growth in the company's core businesses and in the digital entertainment domain. In addition, the transaction enables the launch of new businesses by moving forward with investments in fields including blockchain, AI, and the cloud. Now, it's no secret that the president of Square Enix, Yosuke Matsuda, has expressed his desire for the company to create play-to-earn blockchain games. But it did mention, when we talked about that particular statement that he made in a previous episode, that there was a difference in what Yosuke Matsuda was saying and the way that the typical Western developers and publishers were angling towards NFTs as the future of video games. What I was concerned about was that a lot of the senior executives and boards of directors and people like that are literally at odds with people who play games for entertainment, who play games casually. Yes, there is a market for people who play games to earn money. The play-to-earn market is a thing, but it's nowhere near being the biggest market. The average gamer plays games for fun, and that is the truth of things. Now, I have some concerns about NFTs and their entry into video games, as well as various other aspects that are related to this particular subject. I'll be talking more about those on some episodes that I'm recording exclusively for Patreon. But the Cliff Notes version is that there is a distinct difference between how the East views NFTs and how the West views them. Now, coming back to Square Enix being a victim of their own success, I think that part of that has to do with Final Fantasy XIV and just how successful that has been, especially with the latest expansion and patch 6.1. The game has come a long, long way from version 1.0. This is where things get a little bit speculative, because I would imagine if I was on the Square Enix board of directors and I had these assets and resources here that were clearly draining my finances and we weren't doing anything with them, but on this side, we had someone like Naoki Yoshida, who has done wonders with Final Fantasy XIV and is the director of our upcoming medieval fantasy, Final Fantasy XVI. We've done the Final Fantasy VII remake and various other things like that. We've got all sorts of other things in the pipeline. But we're looking at Final Fantasy 16. It's our next big numbered Final Fantasy project. It's going to be our next big game. And then we look across to Bandai Namco and the success they've had with Elden Ring. Wouldn't that get you thinking, hey, if we pour more resources into Final Fantasy 16 and make it the best it could be, we've already got the guy who can create miracles at the helm, so let's throw more money at that. Where do we get more money? Well, we're not doing anything with these developers and these franchises, so why don't we just sell those? If Elden Ring can find runaway success in the Western market, but still be a very Japanese game, why can't we do the same thing? The Persona franchise has gone from being a niche title to becoming one of the most successful anime-based franchises on the planet. We already have an established brand with Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy 14 is doing so well, it's ridiculous. So why not bank on what we know? So from that perspective, it's not so much that Square Enix are pulling out of the Western market, but maybe returning to their core products to take on the Western market in full. Just like Bandai Namco have done, and just like Capcom have done with the Resident Evil remakes. They're returning to their roots in order to make progress in a way that we probably won't have seen coming. Now I'm going to leave this there because this story does touch on various aspects that I'm going to be doing as a separate project. I won't just leave you hanging out in the cold though. Over at gamesindustry.biz, Brendan Sinclair has written an interesting opinion piece called Square Enix Sale of Western Studios Marks the End of an Existential Crisis. Now some of the stuff that I've mentioned is part of the article. What Brendan Sinclair does is go into more of the history and the rationale behind the Japanese publishers buying these Western developers in the first place. What was the reason? What were their goals? That's the sort of thing. It's really interesting to read. I will link it in the description below, and I would recommend that anyone who has an interest in this particular story of Embracer Group buying these things off Square Enix for such a bargain price has a read of it, because it will inform you and maybe change your perspective. Okay, so that's your lot for today. Do let me know what you thought about the stories that we've covered on this episode in the comments below. I am always interested in finding out what people think. I'll be back on the next episode of Gossip News or on Impossible Mission, whichever comes first. Or if you are one of our Patreon supporters, you'll soon be able to find me on Patreon as well in the exclusive episodes I'll be posting on there. But regardless of where you find me, until I speak to you next, thanks for watching.